Let's start with Chris's question here. Guys, I love Brandon Ayuk and Terry McLaurin as wide receiver targets. If the Steelers offered a third, fourth, and sixth round pick, would that be enough to get either of them in a trade? Quite frankly, Chris, no. Wouldn't be good enough. Probably wouldn't be anywhere close to good enough. I think at bare minimum, you need a first round pick in there for both of them. And maybe for McLaurin, because he's a little older, you could look at it and say a first and a third may be good enough. I think Ayuk, you're probably going a first and a player plus a little bit, depending on who that player is. And that's probably good enough. But you're starting with a first round pick. I think if you tossed a couple seconds out there, maybe you have an opportunity. But I'm not a third, fourth, and a sixth just isn't. It's not even going to come close. It's not even going to be good enough. And I think both of them are great wide receivers. I think that you look at them, you just got to look at the value of the player to what that draft pick would be. And Brandon Ayuk and Terry McLaurin are both they're both first round guys. They're both second round guys minimum plus some. They're not third round guys. You wouldn't draft them in the third round. The Steelers are they're not. I mean, look at Omar Khan does crazy things, but I think that one would blow my mind to come out here and land a third round pick or be able to toss a third, fourth, and sixth round pick at them for either one of those guys, especially because I don't think Terry's on the market. I think the Commanders have come out and said that they want him around this season. I think they should trade him, but I think that door might be shut. Ayuk is probably out there, but they're already asking for the 17th overall pick in Zay Jones. So I think that's where the bar starts if you're the Pittsburgh Steelers. There is some trades out there when it comes to Brandon Ayuk. And, Jerry Dulac said it yesterday in his weekly chat, and he's been dropping bomb after bomb after bomb. He's having a hell of a week. That the door is that it could happen, quote unquote. Oh, it could happen. A trade for Brandon Ayuk. And then Ramon Foster, the Ramon Foster Show, shout out Ramon, good guy, said, what about Brandon Ayuk for Dan Moore Jr.? You'd probably have to toss a first round pick in there. But what about Dan Moore Jr. and a first round pick for Brandon Ayuk? You making that trade? You thinking about it? Nick, what's your thoughts on Brandon Ayuk for Dan Moore Jr. and a first round pick?
My initial thoughts, because whenever you put it in our rundown, the first round pick wasn't there, and I completely spaced thinking, oh, well, then you just draft Amarius Mims and you hope that the two young Georgia guys are able to hold up. But if you trade Dan Moore Jr., there's not a ready-made replacement currently on the free agent market. And if you don't have that first round pick, not to mention all the other holes that you have, you're not going to be able to really get the best option in the draft. So you're really, at that point, bringing in a wide receiver to a team that's not going to have enough time to get him down the field. So I don't think that Dan Moore Jr. is one of the best linemen in the league by any stretch of the word, but I also don't want to go into the NFL draft thinking, okay, it's Broderick Jones and Spencer Anderson, and that is all you have at tackle. I think that's a little bit of a precarious position if you're Omar Khan going into the draft without really any solid tackles or veteran tackles on the roster.
Yeah, so I agree. I think if you don't have a backup plan in place, you're looking at this and you're very, very concerned about what the replacement option is for Dan Moore. And Dan Moore is the fifth best offensive lineman. I mean, currently the fourth because the Steelers don't have a center, but I would imagine they get a center. I think that's where it comes into play is to give up a starter that isn't a wide receiver for a wide receiver. You just filled a hole, replaced or added another hole. You don't have a first round pick. So it's you're kind of taking one step forward, two steps back. That's my thought there is I think Dan Moore Jr. is great. And if you have some belief in Spencer Anderson, cool. I don't know how much belief I have in Spencer Anderson. I don't know how much belief you should have in a guy who's a 7th round pick a year ago, who didn't start a game last season, who barely played at all last season. I just have a very hard time saying that guy's ready to come in here and be your starting right tackle with no hiccups, or at least less hiccups than Dan Moore Jr. is going to give you. I look at it and say, you're better off, because that's how you have to do is you have to evaluate every trade as in what is the opportunity if we don't make this trade compared to the opportunity if we do make this trade. And if the Steelers make a trade and they send Dan Moore Jr. in a first round pick over for Brandon Ayuk, they now need a right tackle. They still need a center. You still need a corner. You still probably need a defensive tackle. I guess you could cross off wide receiver, but the Steelers seem very interested in a wide receiver. I mean, they spent a lot of time with Xavier Worthy at Texas's pro day. They were down in Alabama yesterday. I mean, they're going to go they were looking at, are they bringing in Ricky Pearsall, or they just brought in Ricky Pearsall out of Florida? They're looking at wide receivers. You're not going to get a starter at center in the third round. You're not going to get a starter at left tackle or right tackle in the third round. Just comparatively, you're missing an offensive lineman in 2024 because you got a starting wide receiver. I think it's easier to add a starting wide receiver in the second round or even the third round than it is to go out there and trade for one, take on a massive contract, and then have to replace 2 offensive linemen. The Steelers, I mean, you got to look at it as investments as well. The Steelers, we have said this for years. We've preached this. Derek Bell, who used to be on this podcast, good friend, says constantly that the Steelers need to invest in their offensive line. The trenches are the problem because the Steelers took forever to invest in their trenches. They just started investing in their trenches. And I'm not saying Dan Moore is an investment. He's not. I'm just saying that if your options are to invest in your trenches in your offensive line in the first round, or spend $25 million a year on a wide receiver and give up that first round pick, your best option is to go with a right tackle, is to go with an offensive tackle, is to add to your offensive line. I just think that that's the way to go about it. You can't look at it and say that's the move. Aiyuk is a guy. Look at, I like Aiyuk. I think a trade for Brandon Aiyuk would be awesome. I don't fall for the Justin Jefferson stuff. I think that's way too much money. Stefon Diggs isn't even on the radar. Anybody who's sitting around thinking Stefon Diggs is going to end up in Pittsburgh should go look at what the Pittsburgh Steelers have done this offseason to get rid of the drama, to say, look, we're done with this. This is not us anymore. There are too many issues. And how much drama Stefon Diggs has brought to the Buffalo Bills locker room over the last 2 years. That's not an equation that has fit what the Pittsburgh Steelers have tried to do. Stefon Diggs is a stud. He's a star. He's one of the best route runners. He might be the best route runner, or at least 1B with Deontay Johnson. That's a great replacement, and he fills the slot. But you don't want that guy. You don't want that guy to be the one for George Pickens. You just don't. You want Russell Wilson to be the guy that trains George Pickens. And I look at it as Aiyuk could be that guy. Maybe he's got his whatever, but he's got his moments. But Stefon Diggs is off my board. Brandon Aiyuk, I think, is still available, but I'm starting to fall a little bit less in the Steelers are going to trade for a wide receiver kind of realm, because I just don't know if it's as likely.